My name is Claire Bennett. I am 38 years old, a licensed structural engineer in the state of Wisconsin, and I was standing on the porch of the house where I grew up, listening to my younger brother scream through the screen door the same ultimatum he'd screamed 12 years ago. Only this time, the foundation he was threatening to collapse was literal. Ethan's voice carried through the hallway like a pipe bursting under pressure. Either she moves out, or I will leave for good. I mean it this time, Mom. Choose. I didn't push the door open. I stood there in my work boots, my father's old red toolbox heavy in my right hand, and I waited. I wanted to hear what my mother, Helen Bennett, would say. I needed to know if the load-bearing wall of her spine had been reinforced at all in 12 years, or if it was still made of the same soft plaster. 12 years ago, she had chosen him. She had handed him every dollar of the family savings, $42,316, to be exact, and she had watched me pack 2 suitcases and my father's toolbox into a leaking Corolla while it rained. She had said, "Be practical, Claire. He's starting a family. You're the strong one. You'll land on your feet." I did land. I landed so hard I cracked concrete. But I built something on top of it. And now I was back, not because I was invited, but because the house was dying, and I was the only one who could read its symptoms. Welcome to Lady Payback Story, where we share family stories about quiet strength, firm boundaries, and the moment good people stop paying for the bad behavior of others. If you've ever been the daughter whose labor was assumed and whose bed was negotiable, this story is for you. Leave a comment below and subscribe, because the blueprints of this ending took me 12 years to draw, and you won't want to miss a beam. Let me back up. You need to know who I was before the ultimatum. I grew up in a 1924 craftsman bungalow on Oak Street in Milwaukee's Bayview neighborhood. It was a good house. Narrow windows, built-in bookcases, a porch held up by honest-to-God timber posts that my grandfather installed with his own hands. My father, Robert Bennett, was a carpenter and a part-time contractor. He believed in right angles, level planes, and the gospel of measure twice, cut once. I was the kid who handed him the level. Ethan was the kid who handed him the remote control. From the very start of our childhood, the household operated on an unspoken rule that no one ever bothered to hide, yet no one ever dared to name out loud. Ethan, 2 years my junior, was the household sunshine, the fragile, precious boy child the entire family revolved around. I was the shadow, the support, the steady background structure that kept everything upright so he could shine without effort, without burden, without ever having to learn how to hold weight. I did not resent him as a small child, not at first. I simply learned my place, the way a floor joist learns to accept pressure as its sole purpose. While other little girls spent their weekends playing with dolls and dressing up, I spent mine in the garage and crawlspace with my father. I learned to distinguish every tool by weight and sound before I hit elementary school. I knew the sharp bite of a tape measure, the steady grip of a framing hammer, the precise balance of a torpedo level. My father never treated this like a chore for me. He treated it like apprenticeship, like legacy. He'd kneel down beside me, calloused hands gentle as he adjusted my grip, and tell me that structure was everything in life. Build solid, Claire. Build fair. Everything that lasts relies on equal support. Those words were etched into me long before I understood how thoroughly my own family would break that rule. While I learned to build and repair and reinforce, Ethan learned to receive and demand and take. On weekends, when I was helping my father patch drywall, replace rotted trim, or reinforce porch railings, Ethan was sprawled on the living room couch watching cartoons, eating the snacks our mother set aside exclusively for him. If I paused my work to ask for a drink or a break, I was told to finish my task first. If Ethan complained of boredom or hunger midday, every household chore halted immediately to cater to him. By the time I was 10, I could read a framing plan. By 12, I knew the difference between a king stud and a jack stud. By 15, I was climbing into the crawlspace with a flashlight, checking for termite damage, while Ethan was climbing into my father's good graces with a smile and a report card that never once threatened to be excellent, but was always good enough. Good enough for what? For everything. For patience. For praise. For the down payment that would one day be his. In middle school and high school, the divide only widened. I maintained straight A's, joined the math and science teams, and taught myself drafting software in my spare time, determined to carve out an education and a future that no one could ever take from me. I never asked my parents for new clothes, new electronics, or spending money. I saved every dollar I earned from babysitting and yard work to cover my own school supplies and fees. Ethan, meanwhile, scraped by with average grades, skipped study sessions to hang out with friends, and constantly begged my parents for the latest gaming systems, brand-name sneakers, and weekend spending cash. No matter how much he asked, he never heard no. My mother would brush off his poor grades as youthful distraction, his laziness as teenage restlessness, his entitled attitude as harmless confidence. "He's a boy," she'd always say to anyone who questioned her leniency. "Boys bloom late. We have to nurture him." When I brought home perfect report cards and academic awards, she'd glance at them briefly, mumble a quick, "good job," and turn right back to fixing Ethan's favorite meal or helping him rewrite a sloppy school paper. My achievements were expected. His mediocrity was celebrated. My father's silence compounded the injustice. He saw every late night I spent studying, every weekend I spent working instead of playing, every sacrifice I made to build a stable future for myself. He also saw Ethan's endless idleness, his refusal to learn basic responsibility, his habit of taking every family privilege for granted. But he never corrected Ethan. He never praised my grit. He only retreated into his work, into the safety of wood and nails and measurable structure, where rules were clear and effort always yielded results. The chaos of human favoritism was something he could not fix, so he chose not to look at it. I'm telling you this so you understand something about me. I believe in structure. I believe in foundations. I believe that if you can't see the support system, it's probably failing. For 10 years, I've worked for a firm that restores historic buildings. I've shored up 100-year-old churches, stabilized sinking libraries, and convinced city inspectors not to condemn properties that still had integrity beneath the rot. Numbers obey me. Load calculations obey me. Gravity obeys me. Families, I have learned, do not. There was one folder on my desk at home that I never opened unless I was alone and had whiskey nearby. It was labeled 724 Oak. My childhood address. Inside were receipts, invoices, and tax records. 12 years of them. But I'll get to that. First, you need to hear the phrase that built my childhood, the same way my father built the back deck, unevenly, and with too much weight on one side. This family backs its boys. My father said it at the hardware store. My mother embroidered it into every conversation about the future. It wasn't cruel in their mouths. It was weather. It was just the climate of our home. Ethan was the investment. I was the infrastructure. I was the floor joists, necessary, invisible, and expected to hold up whatever walked across me without complaint. That mantra seeped into every corner of our daily life, shaping every decision, every sacrifice, every allocation of family time, money, and grace. When the family car needed repairs, my parents would delay fixing my reliable, modest sedan to cover Ethan's reckless speeding tickets and impound fees. When holiday bonuses came in, every penny went to Ethan's hobbies and wants, while my Christmas gifts were always hand-me-downs or practical necessities no one bothered to wrap. When household bills piled up, my mother would cut my small personal allowance entirely but never touch Ethan's weekly spending money. As I grew older, I began to take on every household repair and maintenance task to save the family money my parents would otherwise waste on Ethan's frivolities. I fixed leaky faucets, replaced broken light fixtures, repainted peeling walls, patched roof shingles after storms, and cleaned out the clogged gutters every autumn. I learned every nook and flaw of that 1924 bungalow, every weak spot in its structure, every vulnerable point in its aging frame. I knew this house better than I knew my own family's faces. I did it willingly at first, believing that my effort would ease my father's workload, reduce my mother's stress, and bring balance to our small household. I thought that if I was useful enough, strong enough, selfless enough, my parents would finally see me, value me, and love me the way they loved Ethan. That was the quiet, desperate hope I carried through my teens, that utility would earn affection, that sacrifice would earn belonging. I would spend decades learning that this equation never existed in my family. I left for the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee on a full scholarship and a part-time job at a lumberyard. I paid for my own books. I paid for my own rent. I called it independence, and for a long time, that word was the only thing keeping me upright. Ethan stayed home. He attended a 2-year business program at a community college 3 miles from the house, dropped out after 3 semesters, and began a career that my mother called entrepreneurship and that the rest of the world called waiting for his big break. During my entire college career, I never once asked my parents for financial support. I balanced 16 credit hours a semester with 25-hour work weeks at the lumberyard, hauling heavy lumber, sorting hardware, and assisting contractors with material orders after class every day. I ate cheap grocery store oatmeal and frozen vegetables to save money, skipped social events to work overtime, and lived in a cramped, outdated dorm room with no air conditioning through sweltering Wisconsin summers. Meanwhile, Ethan lived rent-free at home, ate home-cooked meals every day, did 0 chores, and spent his days skipping classes, playing video games, and cruising around town in my parents' paid-off SUV. Every time he ran out of money, he simply asked my mother for more, and she handed it over without question. When he failed his community college classes, my parents blamed boring coursework and uninspiring professors, never his lack of effort. When he quit his program entirely, they praised him for chasing bigger dreams, instead of scolding him for wasting tuition money. I visited home once a month during college, and every single visit reinforced my place in the family hierarchy. I would arrive with groceries and small gifts for my parents, spend my weekend fixing household issues they'd ignored, and leave with nothing but quiet gratitude for my brother's continued comfort. My parents never asked how my classes were going, never offered to help with my work stress, never checked if I was struggling to make ends meet. They only asked when I'd get a full-time job, when I'd start earning real money, when I'd finally be in a position to help Ethan launch his vague, never-realized dreams. By my senior year, I had already lined up a prestigious entry-level engineering position in Chicago, a role that would launch my entire career in structural restoration. I'd worked 4 years to earn that opportunity, sacrificing sleep, social life, and personal comfort to build a future no one in my family would help me create. I was proud of myself, proud of the solid, self-made foundation I was laying for my adult life. I had no idea my family was already planning to dismantle it for my brother's fleeting comfort. His big break, apparently, was a woman named Amanda. She was 21, blonde, and allergic to work, as far as I could tell. They announced their engagement on a Sunday in March, 12 years ago this spring. My mother made pot roast. My father made silence. And Ethan made his move. Amanda came from a family that valued appearances over effort, status over substance. Her parents were quick to flaunt their modest wealth, talk up their suburban home, and brag about their daughter's bright future. From the moment Ethan started dating her, he became obsessed with upgrading his lifestyle, with proving to Amanda's family that he was a serious, successful man worthy of their daughter. He had no savings, no stable job, no marketable skills, but he had unshakable confidence that my parents and I would cover every cost of his fake success. Amanda made no secret of her expectations. She refused to live in our aging Bayview bungalow, refused to rent a small apartment, refused to start her marriage with any form of financial struggle. She demanded a brand new suburban townhouse with modern finishes, granite countertops, and a 2-car garage, luxuries none of us could afford, least of all Ethan. And instead of telling his fiancée the truth about his empty bank account and dead-end career, Ethan turned to the only reliable funding source he'd ever known, me, and our parents' lifelong favoritism. We were clearing the table when he pulled out a folder of his own. Not spreadsheets. Brochures. Suburban townhouses with granite countertops and 2-car garages. Amanda's parents said they'll cover the wedding, he announced, but we need a down payment. 40 grand. Minimum. My father, who had just been diagnosed with the early stages of Parkinson's, set down his coffee. My mother looked at the brochures the way she used to look at my straight-A report cards, with hunger, but for someone else. My father's Parkinson's diagnosis had shaken our household that winter. He'd started experiencing small tremors in his hands, subtle enough to hide at first, but impossible to ignore while he worked his carpentry jobs. For a man who'd built his entire identity on steady hands, precise measurements, and physical strength, the diagnosis was devastating. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, spending longer hours alone in the garage, unable to come to terms with his failing body. I'd spent weeks researching treatment plans, connecting him with specialist doctors, and adjusting my college schedule to come home and help with his work when his tremors flared up. I worried endlessly about his health, about his declining ability to support the family, about the quiet grief he carried every day. Ethan, on the other hand, barely acknowledged our father's diagnosis. He never asked how Dad was feeling, never offered to help with household work, never slowed down his reckless spending. In his mind, our father's illness was an inconvenience that might delay the handout he was entitled to. My mother, overwhelmed by my father's declining health and desperate to keep her perfect vision of her son's successful future intact, doubled down on her favoritism. She refused to let Ethan's engagement fall apart, refused to let Amanda's family look down on us, refused to accept that her precious boy might have to start his marriage with humility and hard work. In her eyes, my upcoming Chicago career made me infinitely disposable. I was strong. I was independent. I would survive being pushed out. Ethan would not. Ethan turned to me. Not to ask. To announce. "Claire, you've got that engineering job lined up in Chicago. You're leaving anyway. Amanda and I need the house. We need to start our life here. Near Mom and Dad." I set down the plate I was holding. It was my grandmother's china. It did not crack. I wish it had. It would have given the moment the sound it deserved. In that moment, I saw the full extent of their plan. It was not just the $40,000 down payment they wanted. It was my childhood bedroom, my place in the family home, my permanent connection to the only house I'd ever known. They intended to erase me entirely from the family structure, to turn my lifelong sacrifices and contributions into nothing, so Ethan could have everything without lifting a finger. I'd planned to move to Chicago for work eventually, yes, but I'd always planned to come home. To visit my parents, to care for my father as his health declined, to keep my childhood room as a safe harbor, a place that belonged only to me after years of building and supporting the household. I never imagined my own family would evict me before I was ready to leave, would steal my home and my family's life savings to fund my brother's selfish fairy tale that "I'm not giving you my room, Ethan. I live here. I pay rent." It was true. $300 a month, cash, into a jar my mother kept above the fridge. I had been paying since I graduated. Ethan had never paid $1. I'd paid rent steadily for 2 full years, even while I was in college and only home on weekends. I'd paid utility bills, covered home repair costs, and contributed to grocery expenses every single month. Ethan had never contributed a single cent to household costs, never lifted a finger to maintain the home, never sacrificed anything for the family. Yet he believed he was entitled to take everything I'd built and claimed for myself. That was when he turned to our parents. He didn't look at me again. Not once. He looked at Mom and Dad, and his face shifted into the expression I can only describe as architectural despair, the look of a man who has decided that his entire future depends on a single beam being removed. And he yelled. "Either she moves out, or I will leave for good. I'll take Amanda to her parents' state. You'll never see your grandkids. You'll die in this house alone. Choose." It was the cruelest, most calculated ultimatum he could have delivered. He knew our mother's deepest fear, dying alone, being abandoned by her son, missing out on grandchildren, ending her life in an empty house with no family beside her. He weaponized her love and fear against me, turning a sibling disagreement into an all-or-nothing power play. He did not care about our feelings, did not care about fairness, did not care about the years I'd spent supporting the family. He only cared about getting exactly what he wanted, no matter who he destroyed to get it. The kitchen became so quiet I could hear the refrigerator's compressor click on. My father looked at his hands. My mother looked at Ethan. Then she looked at me. And in that look, I saw the calculation. Not malice. Math. Ethan was the asset. I was the maintenance cost. You don't sell the asset to pay the plumber. You fix the leak yourself, or you learn to live with it. That my father's trembling hand said everything he could not speak. His Parkinson's had already stripped him of his ability to fix physical structures, and now his family's broken emotional structure was crumbling right in front of him, and he was powerless to stop it. He could not bring himself to choose between his two children, so he chose silence, the same silence that had allowed 12 years of unfairness to fester and grow. My mother walked to the hutch. She pulled out an envelope. Inside was a bankbook. Your father and I have $42,316, she said. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of a treasurer closing an account. We were saving it for emergencies. But a family is an emergency. Ethan needs a foundation to build on. Claire, you already have one. You're the strong one. That exact number, $42,316, was seared into my memory forever. It was not a rounded estimate. It was every penny they had saved over 15 years, every dollar set aside for medical emergencies, home repairs, retirement security, and unforeseen family crisis. It was their entire safety net, their entire future security, and they handed it over without hesitation to a son who had never earned a single dollar of it, never appreciated their sacrifice, and never planned to repay them. She handed the envelope to Ethan. He took it without looking inside. My father stood up, walked to the basement door, and went downstairs. He didn't say a word. That was his signature move. When the structure failed, he retreated to the crawlspace. That I did not argue. I did not beg. I did not scream or cry or plead for fairness. In that moment, every last ounce of my childhood hope for parental love and family equality died. I understood finally that strength in my family was not a virtue to be celebrated. It was a burden to be exploited. My resilience, my independence, my ability to build a life for myself was not a source of pride for them, it was a reason to discard me. I packed that night. It was raining. March in Milwaukee, the kind of cold rain that gets into your marrow and stays there. I took my clothes. I took my engineering textbooks. And I took my father's red toolbox from the garage. He saw me lift it off the workbench. He was standing in the doorway, holding a flashlight he wasn't using. He didn't stop me. He didn't help me. He just watched. That toolbox was the only thing he ever gave me that Ethan didn't want. That the rain came down in cold, relentless sheets, soaking my thin jacket and weighing down my suitcases as I carried them to my beat-up 2008 Corolla. The trunk leaked, just like every other part of that worn-out car, and I watched rainwater pool around my textbooks and folded clothes as I loaded the vehicle. I worked silently, my hands steady, my face dry, refusing to give my family the satisfaction of seeing me break. My father stood in the garage doorway the entire time, flashlight hanging limp at his side, his trembling hands visible even in the dim night light. He knew what was happening. He knew it was wrong. He knew I was being exiled for no crime other than being reliable. But he said nothing. He did nothing. He let the rain wash away my childhood, my place in the family, my years of sacrifice, and he never uttered a single word of protest. My mother stood on the porch as I loaded the car. She had a casserole dish in her hands. For the road, she said. I didn't take it. I was done swallowing things to keep the peace. I drove to Chicago with $73 in my checking account, a toolbox that weighed 30 pounds, and a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on the roof of the car. Here is what I did not do. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not call my father from the road and beg him to explain why his hands, which had taught me to swing a hammer, had not reached out to stop this. I drove. I found a parking spot near the lakefront that allowed overnight parking. I slept in the Corolla for 11 nights, showering at a truck stop, eating peanut butter from the jar, until my first paycheck from the lumberyard came through. Those 11 nights sleeping in my car were the hardest, loneliest days of my life, yet they forged every ounce of strength I carry today. The lakefront wind cut through the car's thin windows every night, leaving me shivering under a thin blanket. I woke up at dawn every morning, stiff and sore, to walk 2 miles to the nearest truck stop for a cold shower before my shift. I ate plain peanut butter straight from the jar for every meal, too broke to buy bread or fruit, too proud to call my family and beg for help. I never once reached out to my parents or my brother during those desperate days. I knew they were living comfortably off the family savings I'd been pushed out to protect. I knew Ethan and Amanda were touring townhouses, planning their perfect life, celebrating the money they'd stolen from my future. I knew my parents were quiet and guilty but ultimately satisfied with their choice. They'd kept their son, and they discarded their daughter. That I want you to know who I became, because it matters for what happens next. I became the woman who shows up at 6 a.m. to check rebar before a pour. I became the engineer who can look at a crack in a plaster wall and tell you whether it's cosmetic or catastrophic. I bought a condo in Logan Square at 34, cash. I paid off my student loans. I built a life out of Portland cement and sheer refusal to fall down. Year after year, I climbed higher, built stronger, refused to let my rough start define me. I excelled in my entry-level engineering role, mastered historic structural restoration, earned my professional engineer license, and built a reputation as the most thorough, reliable structural specialist in the region. City inspectors trusted my assessments, contractors respected my expertise, clients sought me out for the most complex, high-stakes restoration projects. That I learned to read failure in structures the way other people read books. I could spot a failing foundation before cracks appeared, identify a compromised beam before sagging began, detect hidden rot and structural decay long before a building showed visible signs of collapse. I applied every lesson I'd learned from my father's carpentry teachings and my own hard-won experience to every project, building safety and stability for buildings that no one else could save. While I built a stable, successful, independent life for myself, my family continued their toxic patterns. Ethan's perfect townhouse dream fell apart within a year. He and Amanda blew the entire $42,000 down payment on luxury furniture, expensive vacations, and reckless partying, never putting a single dollar toward a home purchase. Their engagement collapsed in messy drama, and Amanda left him once his free funding source dried up. Ethan never took responsibility for wasting the family's entire life savings. He never apologized to my parents, never tried to earn the money back, never got a stable job. Instead, he continued to leech off my parents, making endless excuses for his failures, blaming bad luck, blaming Amanda, blaming the economy, blaming everyone but himself. My parents never held him accountable. They simply continued to support him, cutting their own expenses to fund his lazy lifestyle, growing poorer and more strained with every passing year. But there was one account I never closed. One column I never let myself tally. The folder labeled 724 Oak. I told myself it was insurance. I told myself it was just in case. In reality, it was grief. Grief makes you pay any bill that promises the people who threw you out will still have a roof over their heads when you come back. That I could have walked away entirely. I could have cut all ties, ignored their struggles, let the house fall into disrepair, and let my parents face the consequences of their terrible choices. But grief and lingering familial love are not logical. Even after everything they'd done to me, I could not bear to watch my childhood home rot, to watch my father's life work crumble, to watch my parents become homeless or financially ruined in their old age. I could not save my family's broken emotional structure, but I could save the physical structure they were too careless and too selfish to maintain. So I paid. Quietly, anonymously, steadily, for 12 long years. Every January, I paid the property tax bill online. Not the whole thing, my mother still wrote checks for the assessment, but the delinquent portions she missed. I paid the homeowner's insurance premium in October, the year she let it lapse because Ethan needed a loan for the gym. I paid for the new water heater when the basement flooded, and for the roof repair after the ice dam of 2019, and for the structural inspection when the front porch started sagging. I paid through a third-party escrow service. No name. No thank you notes. Just a routing number and a silence that cost me, over 12 years, $67,482. Every single one of those expenses was a cost my parents could not afford, a cost Ethan refused to cover. The delinquent property taxes piled up because my parents spent their disposable income on Ethan's endless requests. The insurance lapsed because they diverted premium money to his fake business ventures. The basement flooded because they ignored minor leaks to fund his gym memberships. The roof rotted because they prioritized his entertainment costs over home maintenance. That every time the house faced a structural crisis, every time a bill went unpaid, every time a critical repair was ignored, I stepped in. I did it anonymously so my parents would not feel obligated to thank me, so Ethan would not feel entitled to ask for more. I did it because I knew the house's structural integrity, knew every weak point, knew exactly what would fail if left unaddressed. I repaired what my family's neglect and greed broke. I never added it up. Deliberately. Some numbers change what you're allowed to keep believing. And I needed to believe I was still part of a house, even if I wasn't part of the family inside it. That I avoided tallying the total cost for 12 years because I knew the number would break the last fragile thread of my familial hope. If I added up every dollar I'd spent saving their home and stabilizing their life, I would have to admit the full truth. I had spent more than $60,000 to protect a family that had thrown me out for $40,000. I had sacrificed 12 years of passive wealth and security to preserve a home that no longer wanted me. Then, 2 weeks ago, the call came. Not from my mother. From a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who still had my number from the time I helped her rebuild her garage in 2016. "Claire," she said. "You need to come home. Your brother is tearing out walls. He's got a camera crew. He says he's flipping the house. And your mother, she's sleeping on the couch because he turned her bedroom into a staging area." Mrs. Gable had watched our family dynamics unfold for 30 years. She'd seen me grow up fixing the house, seen Ethan grow up taking everything. She'd seen me leave in the rain 12 years prior, seen my parents' quiet guilt in the years after, seen Ethan's endless entitlement and destruction. She only called me when the situation became irreparable, when Ethan's reckless renovation put the entire house and my mother's safety at risk. The second I hung up the phone, I grabbed my father's red toolbox from my office shelf, the same one I'd taken the night I was exiled. It was worn now, scuffed at the edges, the red paint faded after 12 years, but every tool inside was intact, polished, and functional. It was the only inheritance I'd ever been allowed to keep, the only piece of my father's legacy that Ethan had never tried to steal. That I was on the porch within 4 hours. The house looked wrong from the curb. The front windows were too bright. The symmetry was off. I could see straight through the living room to the backyard, which meant a wall was gone. A load-bearing wall. I knew it before I stepped inside. I could read the sag in the roofline from the sidewalk. 12 years of quiet maintenance, 12 years of my anonymous repairs, 12 years of careful structural preservation had been destroyed in a matter of days. Ethan's amateur, unpermitted renovation had undone every single safety measure I'd put in place. The historic bungalow's carefully balanced structure, maintained by my grandfather, built solid by my father, stabilized by me for a decade, was now compromised, unstable, and on the verge of catastrophic failure. My mother met me at the door. She was 71. She had lost weight. She had the look of a tenant who knows the eviction notice is coming but hasn't found it on the door yet. "Claire," she said. "I didn't want to bother you. But Ethan says the house is worth more if it's open concept. He says we can sell it and split the money and I can move to a condo. He says it's what Dad would have wanted." She was desperate, worn down, and still trapped in her old patterns of prioritizing Ethan's wishes over truth. She wanted to believe my father would have approved of this destruction, wanted to believe Ethan's greedy scheme was a legitimate plan, wanted to avoid facing the fact that she'd spent 12 years rewarding destruction and punishing devotion. She was not evil. She was just cowardly, too afraid to confront the son she'd spoiled for a lifetime. My father had been dead for 2 years. Parkinson's took him slowly, piece by piece, the way water erodes limestone. He died in the bedroom Ethan had now converted into a storage unit for sample tiles. I didn't think my father would have wanted his daughter sleeping on a couch while his son destroyed the bearing wall his own father had built. But I didn't say that. I said, "Show me the basement." I needed to see the damage for myself, to assess the structural failure only my trained eyes could recognize. Amateur homeowners see open floor plans and cosmetic updates. Licensed structural engineers see compromised load paths, failing joists, unsupported roof weight, and impending collapse. What Ethan viewed as a profitable flip was a death sentence for the historic bungalow. The beam was gone. A 4x12 Douglas fir header, original to 1924, had been chainsawed out to create a flowing entertainment space. In its place was a decorative metal pole that looked like it had been stolen from a strip mall yoga studio. The ceiling joists above were already beginning to crown. The plaster in the dining room was spiderwebbed with cracks. I ran my hand along the exposed lath. The house was crying out in a language only I could understand. The damage was far worse than I'd feared. The century-old Douglas fir header had carried the entire load of the second-floor ceiling, the roof rafters, and half the upper structural weight for 100 years. Removing it without temporary shoring or structural replacement was a textbook catastrophic error. The decorative metal pole Ethan installed was purely aesthetic, incapable of bearing even a fraction of the required structural load. The subtle crown in the joists was the first stage of progressive failure. Within months, the ceiling would cave, the roof would sag, and the entire front half of the house would collapse. I went back upstairs. My mother was making tea in the kitchen that had not changed since 1998. Ethan came in through the back door, carrying a sledgehammer over his shoulder like a baseball bat. He was 34 now. He had the same smile. The same entitlement, aged like cheap wine. Well, he said. The prodigal daughter returns. Come to claim your inheritance? Too late. Mom already signed the listing agreement. We close in 30 days. He was arrogant, unapologetic, and completely oblivious to the disaster he'd created. He'd brought in a social media camera crew to film his home renovation flip, posing as a talented, self-made entrepreneur, hiding the fact that he'd destroyed a historic structure, operated without permits, and endangered his own mother's living space. He saw me as a nuisance, a bitter rival come to ruin his latest scheme, not as the person who had saved his home for 12 years. I looked at my mother. Did you? She wouldn't meet my eyes. He said the house is too much for me. He said I need the money for assisted living. He said if I didn't sell, he'd leave. He'd take the grandkids and I'd never see them. Claire, he's my son. There it was. The same equation. The same threat. The same trembling hand signing away the foundation to keep the prodigal son from walking. Only this time, I was not 26 and sleeping in a car. This time, I was a professional. And the house was not just my childhood. It was a structure under my care, whether my name was on the deed or not. I set my father's toolbox on the kitchen table. The sound it made was a declaration. Ethan, I said. My voice was the one I used in court-ordered inspections. Flat. Factual. Final. You removed a load-bearing wall without a permit. The house is structurally unsound. It cannot be sold. It cannot be occupied. And if you try to close on this property without disclosing that, you will be committing real estate fraud. He laughed. The same laugh from 12 years ago. Big, barrel-chested, borrowed from a man who had never done an honest day's labor. You're not a realtor, Claire. You're just jealous because I'm finally making something of this place. Mom wants me to have it. She's always wanted me to have it. I'm the son. You're a squatter, I said. And you're standing in a house that's about to collapse. I opened the toolbox. Not for a hammer. For a file. I pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were 12 years of receipts, tax records, and insurance documents. But that wasn't my weapon. My weapon was the letterhead I pulled out next. The one from my firm. The one with my PE stamped out. Every receipt in that envelope was proof of my silent, decade-long dedication. Every tax payment, every insurance premium, every repair invoice was dated, documented, and verifiable. I had saved every single record, not for revenge, but for accountability. I'd known someday my family's recklessness would catch up to them, and I'd need proof of who had truly sustained this house. I'm filing a structural integrity report with the city of Milwaukee tomorrow morning, I said. I'm also filing a lien disclosure. This house has $62,000 in unpaid maintenance debt that I have personally carried. I am notifying the title company. You will not sell this house. You will not inherit this house. You will not flip this house for your next startup. This house is going into emergency structural review, and the only person licensed to sign off on its repair is me. The silence that followed was the silence of a load finally finding its true path to the ground. Ethan looked at my mother. She's bluffing, he said. But his voice had thinned. My mother looked at the receipts. She looked at the cracks in the ceiling she had learned not to see. She looked at me. For the first time in 12 years, she was forced to confront the full weight of her choices. She saw the stack of receipts proving every critical home repair, every delinquent bill, every insurance premium had been paid by me. She saw the spiderwebbing cracks in the ceiling she'd ignored to appease Ethan. She saw the professional engineer's stamp that carried legal authority over her son's reckless scheme. She could no longer pretend Ethan was the responsible child, no longer pretend I was the selfish one. You paid for the roof, she asked. And the taxes? All these years? Someone had to, I said. Because the man you gave all the money to didn't pay for a single shingle. I turned to Ethan. You want to leave? Leave. You threaten that like it's a punishment. But this time, Mom isn't choosing between us. She's choosing between a contractor who gutted her house and an engineer who saved it. The bank is closed, Ethan. And the foundation is mine. He left that night. Not because I yelled. Because I had outbuilt him. He took his sledgehammer, his sample tiles, and his camera crew, and he drove away in a leased SUV that my mother's credit had co-signed for. I watched him go from the porch. My mother stood beside me. She was crying. The quiet, ashamed tears of a woman who has finally read the inspection report on her own life and found it lacking. I didn't comfort her right away. I went to the basement. I took measurements. I called a crew I trusted, men and women who knew my work, not my family. We installed temporary shoring that weekend. We ordered a new LVL beam, custom cut, to replace the one Ethan had destroyed. I worked beside them in my father's old coveralls, which I'd kept in the toolbox for 12 years, and which still fit that every measurement I took was precise, every calculation exact, every repair method aligned with historic restoration standards. I stabilized the failing joists, reinforced the compromised roof structure, and secured the sagging ceiling before any further damage could occur. My crew worked efficiently, following my every direction, recognizing the emergency of the structural failure Ethan had created. On Sunday evening, my mother brought me a cup of coffee in the basement. She sat on the workbench, where my father used to sit, and she said the truest thing she had ever said to me. I spent $42,000 buying his presence, she said. And I spent 12 years driving away the only person who ever paid to keep this house standing. I don't know how to fix that, Claire. You don't, I said. You can't. But you can let me fix the house. And you can stop signing checks for love that never clears. She moved in with me 3 weeks later. Not because I demanded it, but because the house needed 6 months of structural work, and she was too old to live in a construction zone. She sleeps in my guest room now. She has her own key. She does not pay rent. The first morning she was there, I found her at my kitchen table, adding up numbers on a napkin. She looked up when I came in, and she said, "I'm figuring out what I owe you." I took the napkin. I crumpled it. "You don't owe me money, Mom. You owe me the truth. And you're paying it back one honest conversation at a time." Ethan called once, 3 months later. Not to apologize. To ask if I could expedite the repairs, because he'd found a buyer who didn't care about permits. I told him the same thing I tell developers who want me to sign off on shortcuts: gravity doesn't negotiate. And neither do I. He hung up. I have not heard from him since. The house on Oak Street is still under scaffolding. It will be for a while. We're not just replacing the beam. We're restoring the original blueprint. We're sistering the joists. We're making it stronger than it was when it was built, because now it has to carry the weight of what actually happened inside it. Last Tuesday, I was in the basement, checking the new pier footings, when my mother came down with an envelope. Mrs. Gable found this in her mailbox, she said. She thinks it blew over from our old porch. It was addressed to me. My name, in my father's handwriting, shaky from the Parkinson's, dated 2 weeks before he died. Inside was a single page. No greeting. No signature. Just a sentence: the toolbox was always yours. The house should have been too. I was too afraid to level what needed leveling. Don't be. I read it twice. Then I folded it into my pocket, and I went back to work. Some foundations you can't pour until the old concrete has been broken. Some walls you can't raise until the rotten timber has been pulled. And some families you can't save. But the structure can always be saved. If you're willing to be the one holding the level. If this story reminded you of a foundation you've been holding up alone, leave the word structural in the comments. And subscribe. Because the next story is about the house we build after the one we were born in finally falls. I'll see you then.